Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the worker experience. I'm Ron Wirtz, Regional Outreach Director at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. We're excited to discuss some new research, survey research by the Minneapolis Fed in partnership with the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards. We hope new insights that we're learning will begin a more robust narrative related to the current labor market dynamics, which we all know are really in flux right now. But before I move into some of the content portion of the webinar, I have a few housekeeping items. Slides for this presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees next week. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars on regional economic conditions. We're going to post those in a link in the chat box, should be there very shortly, where you can find past webinars as well as this one when we're done. There will also be more information on future webinars by the Minneapolis Fed toward the end of my formal remarks today. So the second half of the webinar will feature a moderated Q&A with leaders in the workforce development field. I'm really looking forward to that. I will be moderating that Q&A session and would love to get questions from all of the attendees in the audience that can pose questions to our panelists. If you have a question, you can pose that question in the chat box at any point. I also want to take a second to welcome our discussion panelists, Tammy Beery and Sahur Hussain of Career Solutions, and Jenny Rittman of Workforce Development, Inc. I will introduce each of them more fully once we move to the Q&A portion of the program. Lastly, we'd love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation, so please take a moment to fill out the 30-second survey that pops up in your Zoom window when we exit this webinar. With that, let's turn to the featured content. Before I do, I have to give you my disclaimer. So basically, the views presented here are mine. In this formal presentation, they're mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve System. So what are we going to talk about today? So the first thing is I'm going to give you a little background on the Minneapolis Fed's Worker Experience Initiative and why we did this particular survey. I'm also going to give you a brief intro of our survey partner, the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards, and I'm going to give you a lot of survey results. And at the very end, in the second half, as I mentioned, we're going to do moderated Q&A with the three panelists that I mentioned. So let me begin by giving you a little background on this thing called the Worker Experience Initiative at the Minneapolis Fed. So I think most people are familiar with the fact that the Federal Reserve System tracks the current economy. Okay, and we do it by we do a lot of outreach in a lot of different ways. Most of that outreach is to businesses. So we do a lot of surveys, a lot of direct contact. We have advisory councils and other things to try to give us a lot of information from businesses about how the economy is doing. And the reason we do that is that large companies and reaching out to lots of companies really does give us a very good idea about aggregate economic activity. And not only among businesses, but then writ large, we can also find out how activity is across states, across industry sectors, and other insights. The problem with this, though, is that this business first view is very one-sided, especially as it relates to today's labor market, which is in, like I mentioned, kind of a state of flux that we haven't seen at least recently. Right now, there are lots of job openings, but employment itself is still well below pre-pandemic levels, and we know that labor re-entry has been slower than expected. Labor force participation right now is still below pre-pandemic levels, despite all of these job openings. And the problem is that we don't have a good systematic grasp on why that's the case. So let me transition to this idea of workers. Really what the problem is that we don't have good information about workers, and especially job seekers and others that are not in the labor force. We don't know much about their work objectives. We don't know much about their views on job opportunities or the obstacles that they face in terms of job matching. That's not the case when we talk about business. Just to kind of give you an idea of kind of the differences here, the way we follow firms is through this thing called NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System. It has roughly 2,000 categories of different ways to kind of splice and dice businesses. There's really no comparable data for workers, and especially non-workers, those that maybe would be interested in working but aren't getting unemployment or otherwise actively looking for work. There are a few things. There's an occupational data set that comes out once a year. There's also the American Community Survey, which does offer a lot of detail on households, but it's really quite dated. The most recent release is 2020. And for the most part, that's a data set that's really meant for researchers. It's not kind of a real-time assessment of worker conditions. So we are trying to make some inroads in this space, and we are undergoing this thing called the Worker Experience Initiative. And it sounds obvious to say, but this effort is really fairly simple. We're trying to understand the current labor market conditions from the labor or the worker point of view. We're trying to get job seekers experience regarding job search, as well as the obstacles that they face to getting preferred jobs. Why are we doing this? We happen to think that labor force participation might be the most important factor in long-term economic growth. The way we're getting into this space is that we don't really have the relationships to go right to workers. They're very disaggregated. So we decided that we're going to start with intermediaries, those organizations that serve job seekers. We've done 6 surveys all together. We started with Career Force literally about a year ago. We've also done a survey with North Dakota Job Services, the Montana Workforce Services Division, the Minnesota Employment Services Coalition, which is a lot of the large nonprofit job service providers. And then lastly, the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards that we did this past January of 2022. With this group of surveys, we've seen very consistent themes where when we did the first couple, we obviously shared that information with all of our partners. So some people saw that information, but we weren't really comfortable kind of making it broadcast because we wanted to make sure that what we were hearing was at least thematically consistent. And we feel like now we have that, and that's why we're doing this webinar to start that discussion. So a little on our survey partner, the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards, just so you have that context. There are 16 area workforce councils, and that's who make up the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards. They're kind of an umbrella for delivering a lot of workforce services. Each council provides, leadership and direction to their particular area and tailored to community needs. Just a quick shout out, not only to my panelists who are part of MOB, but others that are listening today, maybe others that will listen to this maybe down the road a bit. Really helpful organization. I think really positioned perfectly in terms of helping us get this message out and really helping to shape some of our research at the Minneapolis Fed regarding this. So let me tell you a little bit about the survey. So the survey itself is a survey that went to staff that have job seeker contact at these MOB organizations, okay? We asked staff essentially to assess their job seeking clientele, to give us their best impressions based on a number of different things, what they see in their job clientele, their job seeking clientele. We got almost 130 responses. It's uncertain exactly what our response rate was. We think it's at least 25% or better. I should stress this is not a scientific study. In essence, this is really a professional kind of secondhand interpretation of what these staff people are seeing in the job clientele. We do hope to be able to go a level lower to workers. Again, that's going to have to be in future stages. We are confident, though, that these general findings are, we're confident of these general findings because we have seen many of these themes repeated over in those other surveys that I mentioned. But I do want to caution everybody to interpret all of this cautiously, because I think this survey really raises a lot more questions than answers, and I think that'll become more obvious once I get into some of the survey results themselves. I think it really reflects how little we know about job seekers themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the data itself in terms of the survey. So we're going to talk about demographics, work history, and demand for services first. So as the staff respondents told us, this is the demographics of the job seekers. So they generally are seen, as you would expect, age groups that are in the larger percentages of labor force participation, kind of traditional working people. The largest share of clientele was white, with smaller shares among other races and ethnicities. There was a fairly notable share of immigrants. I mentioned this in part because the survey that we did in October with the Minnesota Employment Services Coalition, their clientele actually was the largest single share was among Black and African American clients. So we are seeing some differences in some of the survey clientele. We are also seeing slight changes in some of the responses, but generally not very big changes, only I would say small shades of gray. In terms of education, most of the clientele are high school diploma or less, but there are scatterings of all other education levels. Also, a very wide variety of work histories, and I'll talk a little bit more about this one. Many have children, either single, and they themselves are either single or married. Many are receive some kind of government assistance. So in terms of getting into some of the data, I'm going to offer you a lot of charts. I'm going to explain a couple of them because there is some complexity. So because we don't know, we can't expect staff to know exactly the share of certain kinds of traits. We kind of gave them ballpark figures to say what share of of clientele or job seekers kind of fit this description. So that's what you see here. So the shades of different colored shades are kind of a range of a share of job seekers that they particularly see. So in this case, we asked them, what's the work history of your clientele? And so if you go to the legend on the right, the share of clients or job seekers, the darkest green color, for those that said that picked 75 to 100%, that's for laid off. If you go up to the top of the chart, then laid off from regular full-time work, roughly about 10% said that's virtually all of the people that they see. And then there are different shares because we wanted to try to get a gradient of like who the clientele really are. What this chart says, all that said, is that job seekers come with a really wide variety of work and not work histories. If you go to the top two bars on this chart, the top one says you're laid off from regular full-time work. So you work, and then stop. And that's why you're looking for service. The very next one is that there's little or no work history. And it could be for lots of different reasons. Maybe you're a student or a homemaker. You've just been unable to find a job. So it's not work, trying to find work. So there's really a big difference in the types of clients that the MOB members are seeing. And I think it starts to describe just how nuanced the working population is. So we also wanted to know, how was the demand for services? So again, remember that the survey was done in January, and we asked them, how is it compared to 3 months ago? And what they were saying to us is that they were seeing higher clientele demand. What's the driver behind that? Really hard to say. The survey doesn't ask that specifically. So in looking at the comments, some of the repeated answers to what's driving it are, there was less fear of COVID at the time. There's there is some consequence of being unvaccinated as well. So that's maybe why they are looking for services. There was also several mentions of a large employer layoff. And then there was some evidence that the end of the pandemic unemployment benefits also maybe is driving some of the increase in clientele. So let's talk a little bit about job objectives and success rates. So the first, we asked 2 questions about job goals. So part 1 of this is to kind of get a macro view. Basically, are you looking for part-time or full-time work or something else? And what this chart says roughly is that most people are looking for full-time. Certainly not everyone. But for the most part, that is what kind of comes out on the screen more than anything. So I was kind of curious about seeing how this matched up with the number of job vacancies that are out there. So the Department of Employment and Economic Development does a job vacancy survey every year. And the most recent number that I have says there are 205,000 job vacancies. Broken down by full or part-time, you can see the spread there on the left. It kind of matches with what job counselors were saying about their clientele. But the thing we don't know is whether or not the people looking for full-time work were finding a similar share of full-time opportunities, and same with part-time. So we don't know whether or not those looking for part-time versus full-time are seeing the jobs that they want that are part-time versus full-time. We also asked job seekers, we kind of gave them a laundry list of different objectives that we think, that as we've developed this survey over 6 iterations, these seem to be fairly common, if nothing else evident in the fact that we didn't get a lot of other suggestions about what might be a big objective. So we feel pretty good about this particular list. And what you see when you ask job counselors, what are your clients looking for in terms of jobs, better pay still stands out. That also has been very consistent. But the 2 things that I would point to myself that I think is starting to become more and more important is this notion of flexibility. And those are the third and fourth one from the left. Generally speaking, we're seeing that more workers want flexibility. Maybe now they've always wanted it. Maybe now we're just seeing that there's the opportunity. So that's really what they're looking for. If you think about the home or telework option, that wouldn't have been probably even on the screen at all before the pandemic. So that's really a new wrinkle here as well. We also wanted to know about success rate, of course, because that's really what all of this is about in terms of job counselors helping their clientele. Is we want to get them into jobs, and they are reporting that generally speaking, compared with 6 months ago, they were seeing more success rate in terms of getting workers into jobs. Again, we didn't ask exactly what was behind that, but in terms of some of the comments, they mentioned that there's just more jobs available, and the data says that very clearly, including those that were previously affected by COVID restrictions. So you had COVID restrictions that especially affected the hospitality and tourism sector, especially like in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so a lot of those jobs have become more available. There are also some reports that there's more relaxing of job requirements and qualifications. So the qualifications necessary to get a job have changed, so more people are qualified and helping that job matching process. So we also asked about group difficulties. We're trying to get kind of a framework idea of who is having success and, more importantly, maybe who is not. So we tried to give, we asked job counselors among these kind of large groups of workers, can you tell us who's having more difficulty than others regarding finding a job? And what I would say that this shows is that job seekers having the most trouble have really a lot of different traits and circumstances. You have less educated, you have some age issues, immigration status, or new immigrants, excuse me, disabled, single parent, a lot of very different kinds of characteristics. And I think what that points out is that there are lots of cross-cutting and probably compounding factors. You're probably not a single one of these. You're probably multiple parts of this. And so I think this notion that, there's any silver bullets, I think we have to rethink that idea, because there are lots of different characteristics that I think suggest some job difficulty. So let's talk about job matching and the obstacles to them. When here, to me, this is really kind of the core of what we're trying to get at. And what I'm hoping is that this really helps to broaden the conversation about how do we get more people into work. So we ask 3 different questions regarding obstacles. And I'll kind of go to the end first. What we've found is that there are really a multitude of obstacles that different individuals face. And over the course of 6 surveys, what really has become more obvious is that there's kind of 3 buckets of challenges or obstacles. One of them is worker-based. So the person looking for work does have challenges that kind of come to the fore. Okay, but there are also some that are employer-based, and I'll discuss those as well. And then there are some that are related more to the economic environment or the or government policy that influences kind of the environment that job matching takes place in. And I'll also talk a little bit about that. Regarding this particular one related to workers, I would note that personal motivation is the top one up there, but I would point out 2 things. There are lots of other issues that are in play here that are very significant. And it's not obvious whether it's unclear right now the extent to which all of these other issues essentially affect a person's motivation. So if by chance you happen to have a criminal record, or you don't have a lot of good hard skills, it may be very, very tough to get a job. And so those things I think probably lead to motivation issues that some of the job counselors are noting here. There are also employer-based challenges. And I think the thing to think about here is when jobs are plentiful, workers get to be a little bit more choosy. And when they are, some jobs frankly just don't look very attractive. And they also have a chance to take a look at the hiring practices. And what we hear fairly regularly, one of the larger elements of this particular question is that many just don't hear back from employers, especially when there seems to be a lot of jobs available. I've been a little surprised at the number of responses that say, I just don't hear back from employers. I apply and I apply and I apply and I don't hear back. So I think there are some things that employers also have to maybe be cognizant of if we're trying to improve that job matching process. Then there's this other third bucket, and this is a little bit of a catch-all because it's hard to categorize everything, in more definitive terms. So what I would say basically is that some challenges kind of reside outside of the worker and the employer. It's kind of the environment that in which job matching happens. The one thing I would point out is that affordability of daycare has consistently been at the top of the concerns in terms of helping people get back to work. Affordability and availability of housing has as well. And I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that in a second. But as you can see, there are different things. I think people are also worried about the potential loss of government assistance because there are cliffs involved. You may, as soon as you earn too much money, a certain support mechanism might be pulled whole cloth, and getting that benefit back if by chance you lose that job is very difficult. So I think there are a lot of things in play here that are outside the worker's responsibility or workers' control, as well as employers. And I think some of those things we have to be cognizant of as well. Other obstacles. So in this survey, we're also often trying to kind of figure out how we triangulate. So we're getting at certain issues a little bit more comprehensively. And again, I think this is maybe a little bit more of the same in the sense that it just points out that there's job matching friction from lots of different sources. So we asked our job counselors in general, why do you think job seekers are not taking available jobs? And a lot of issues come up with the family or household. I should point out in the worker slide that I showed a couple of slides ago, I failed to include a transportation option. I had done it in earlier surveys and somehow it got deleted in this particular one. I apologize for that because we know for a fact that that transportation and access to jobs is a really important issue, and it shows up right here in this particular one. But there are lots of other issues as well. And I think the point here is that, when we think about the narrative that we hear from employers, I think they often talk about external sources, especially related to worker motivation and other worker kind of based factors. I think workers communicate something different. So I think there's a more qualitative narrative that we have to start understanding, I think, if we're going to problem solve here. And my last content slide here, and then I'll have just a few last remarks before we get to the Q&A. We also asked job seekers, or we asked the staff, on average, which of the following actions do you think your clients would take to get a preferred job? And generally, what we have heard very consistently in this survey is that many are not interested or willing to move to a new location. Now, we don't know why, and I think that's when I mentioned there might be more questions than answers in this survey. New questions like that, I think, are kind of the next phase of where we need to learn more. I have a feeling part of it is because of the housing crunch that I mentioned earlier, the lack of affordable housing. People that may have housing now may be very reluctant to move to a new job because they may not be able to find housing or housing that they can afford. So I think there's a lot of nuance that we would want to get under here to better understand. I think most are interested in training and or a new line of work. I think that's good. We do know also that people are pretty reluctant to maybe give up government assistance. Again, that there might be a lot underneath that as it relates to benefit cliffs and things of that nature that kind of pull out the support that they need in order to work consistently. So I think there's a lot to learn there. Generally speaking, it's a very complicated matter. Hopefully we can learn more as we go. So some final thoughts. To me, and I'm going to ask the panelists here as well, I don't know that there are really a lot of big surprises here. We've always known that job seekers face difficulties in terms of job matching. What we're hoping to bring here, I think, is just more attention and focus to these issues and really try to organize a better framework for problem solving. In my opinion, and again, these are my opinions, I think we need to get a better understanding of the worker outside of the workplace to understand the factors that both facilitate and impede a person's ability to engage in work. Why do you ask that, Ron, or why do you say that? Well, and why now? As I mentioned, obstacles have always been present, but they're more important now because of a long-term labor shift. In the past, we've had a labor surplus, which meant employers can be choosy, and they were foolish not to be choosy about finding the best employees. Right now, we have really significant labor tightness. And that means workers have leverage. And if they have leverage, we really have to pay more attention to the obstacles that many of them face if we want more people to work. Now, let's be clear. We can decide to just keep doing what we're doing and maybe not pay attention to some of those things. Then I think we have to be comfortable with the same labor problems that we have now. Generally, problem solving is going to benefit everybody. It's going to benefit job seekers, it's going to benefit businesses, and that's going to benefit the overall economy. So I think it's a really good strategy. And the good news, I think it's really clearly already happening. We are hearing about significantly higher wages. We are hearing about more jobs that have better flexibility. I think the part of the chore here is, can we accelerate this process for everyone's benefit? I think we can by better understanding the needs and maybe the demands of workers. And we're hoping that these efforts will really help that transition to help everybody. That is the end of my formal remarks. Before I get to the Q&A portion, I want to just mention a couple upcoming webinars. On Friday, we have a construction sector update. More importantly for this group, we have a follow-up to this. It's a different set of survey data that my colleague Eric Garcia Luna has done with the statewide community action partnership offices. And he won't be presenting on all of the states, but he's doing this survey right now from in Minnesota, both Dakotas, and Montana. He won't be presenting on all of those states, but there's going to be some initial data coming out on May the 12th. So if you're interested in this particular webinar, we hope that you'll join that one as well. And then we also, I think related to what we're talking about here, we are also doing a survey through First Children's Finance on the health of the childcare sector. We'll be rolling out that data on Thursday, May the 19th. You'll be getting information on all of these webinars in the future, and we hope that we will see you again at those. And so with that, I would like to bring our panelists onto screen. And while we do that, I am going to quickly introduce all three of them. So Tammy Beery is the Executive Director at Career Solutions that serves the greater St. Cloud area. Career Solutions serves dislocated workers and at-risk youth and adults by providing career guidance, training, and job-related programs, as well as assisting employers with their workforce needs. Tammy works with multiple programs and partners to encourage joint participation and collaboration in order to achieve positive workforce outcomes for both job seekers and employers. Sahur Hussain is a career planner at Career Solutions in St. Cloud also, so she works with Tammy and works with the Adult Dislocated Worker Program and immigrant communities. Sahur has her bachelor's in community health from St. Cloud State University and global career development, and is a global career development facilitator. She has a certificate in that from Normandale Community College. Jenny Rittman is the Executive Director of Workforce Development, Inc., a leader in employment and training services serving the greater Rochester area. She has been in the workforce development field for 20 years and also heads the Workforce Development Board of Southeast Minnesota, serving 10 counties. Early in her career, she was a career counselor and has held leadership roles in youth development and strategic nonprofit management. So welcome today to our panel. I really appreciate everyone's involvement here. So if I might, let me stop sharing here. Should have done that earlier. So I appreciate everyone's involvement in this Q&A. Sahur, if I can call on you first, I'm curious. So you're on the ground working with job seeking clientele, and I'm wondering if you might just give us a sense for how true some of these survey results ring to you, and maybe what was missing in here.
Thanks, Ron. So I actually was one of the people that did the surveys as well. So a lot of the questions, I didn't find them as much of a surprise. This is kind of what I see on a daily basis as a career planner. I think one of the surveys you mentioned was that there was a lot of full-time. So in our program with the dislocated worker, we do work with those who were laid off from large employers sometimes or smaller employers. But one thing on there is also we do work with people who are still working full-time, but they're considered underpaid. So that goes into the other part of the low-paying section where they are working full-time, but they're still not meeting the basic needs. And that is true on our end, specifically for the immigrant communities, that's who typically would come into our adult program, where they're still working, but it's not enough.
Thank you, Zahur. Any thoughts, Ginny or Tammy, on that same question?
I think for me, one of the things that really stood out, that may not be a surprise necessarily to me because I'm in the field, but maybe to others, is if you look at the actual percentage of those trying to find finding a job in a new career, that has really increased. And we've seen that in our offices too. You know, people coming in that were maybe in healthcare and want to try a different sector. Entrepreneurship also, if you look at the numbers that you shared, Ron, those are pretty high numbers for individuals that are interested in starting their own business. So I think that's a change from, you know, we've always heard better pay is needed. We've always heard those kinds of things, but in this market, those two things I think are a little bit new, a little bit of a new challenge for us.
Thanks, Judy. Go ahead, Tammy.
If I can add, Ron, you know, I mean, there weren't surprises to me, but they may be surprises to employers. You know, some of the barriers to employment, transportation, housing, childcare, you know, unless you have a child and you're trying to find daycare right now, you don't understand the magnitude of that challenge. You know, people will make 100 phone calls to daycare providers to see if they have an opening when they're pregnant. I mean, that's how it is in our community. That can vary across the state, but, you know, understanding the challenges your employees could be going through to achieve or overcome some of these barriers. And to the point of moving jobs or moving location for a new job, you know, think about that process. You need the, you know, down payment on an apartment. You need to have the moving expenses. The magnitude of that on someone who could be, you know, financially struggling is huge. So I can see where that's a huge barrier to finding employment elsewhere. So I guess just stepping back and understanding the magnitude of these barriers on potential job seekers.
I'm curious, Tammy, if I can come back to you to start. The next question is, where would you put us on the continuum as it relates to employers and employer awareness of some of these things? Has it been accelerating during the pandemic? Can you give me some assessment on how far we have to go in terms of maybe employers thinking in a way that may help themselves, I guess?
So childcare is one that I'll use as an example. That has been magnified, especially in our community. In the metro, childcare centers were 80% of the service providers and 20% in-home. In central Minnesota, it was the reverse. We had 80% of the childcare being done in home centers versus large centers was about 20% of it. And with the pandemic, so many of them closed or they found new jobs because they needed sustainable employment. And if they had a COVID case, they were shut down for 2 weeks. So they had no income for 2 weeks, and then they'd open back up. They'd have another case. They'd close for another week or two. So it became unsustainable for them to, you know, keep supporting their family with that income. So we have a huge childcare shortage here in central Minnesota, and I think as employers have engaged in that conversation, we're all trying to brainstorm as a community how we can help overcome some of those challenges.
So Zahur or Ginny, any additional thoughts on the employer question, or maybe piggybacking on the daycare?
Yeah, I think I'll just add that, I mean, we have seen a lot of employers reaching out to us, more employers than ever really reaching out to us and wanting to be part of the solution. And, you know, relying on us as an organization that can help with some of those services for folks. But I would say that we're at the very cusp of that. You know, I think that employers are still kind of wondering what their role is or should be or could be, and kind of waiting to see what other employers are doing and their best practices. So I think it's a really great opportunity, honestly, because it's a time for us to really address some of those issues. And as the pain gets gets worse for those employers, unfortunately, we have many more of them coming to the table for those conversations, and that's where it starts. So I see it, I see opportunity there as well as a challenge, and we are having a lot more conversations with employers about some of these barriers.
Thanks, Jenny. Suhur?
So on my end, I've seen, employers trying to find ways to change their workforce. So maybe reaching out to communities that they haven't reached out to before or aren't typically in their workforce. So a little change in reaching out to other communities aside from those that they typically get applicants for. Yeah.
Thanks, Suhur. So Jenny, I'm going to go to you with this, and this is a question from John, who's listening, and he points to job search. He still thinks job search is horrible. He asks, why is it still job by job rather than business by business? If a person has skills and abilities and interests, why aren't businesses kind of looking for kind of more general? I think if I can characterize John's question, why aren't they looking more for skill sets rather than maybe specific people and their experience?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and it's a great, or kind of an interesting way of looking at applications. I will say, just one of the things I'll say is that I do think that the whole application system or software that employers are using, it is very outdated. I mean, we're still hearing that it tends to exclude versus include and weed people out versus trying to find talent or find various skill sets. And so especially in this labor market, I think that's one thing that definitely needs to be looked at. We hear from many qualified career seekers that they're not even getting a call back or they're not even getting an interview, and they have the skills. And so, clearly there's a disconnect there. And then to answer the question about, the skill set, I think if I had to speak for, employers, I think one of the challenges is that they're just trying to stay above water right now. And so they are changing hiring practices and they are changing some of their application processes, but it's a slow uphill battle. And when they're just trying to, fill orders with 100 short staff, I think that's part of the challenge right now. So change is happening. It's just slow, and we need to continue to move in the right direction.
Suhur or Tammy, any thoughts?
Just to add on to that, we hear from employers a lot about being ghosted by either interview candidates or new hires. And if you listen to the presentation, you might have heard that the job seekers are kind of feeling the same way, that the system is so automated, it becomes impersonal, and they don't feel like they're getting communication from employers either when they apply to jobs. So I think that relationship through COVID has become very virtualized, and there's not a relationship there. There's not that sense of responsibility or ownership to communicate with each other. And I think that's led to some frustrations.
Suhur, any thoughts?
I think one of the barriers for the job seekers that I typically see, I know with the way everything is moving with technology, a lot of the job seekers that I work with have difficulties with technology. They may not have access to computers. So with all the companies and positions, they're all online. They have to apply online. When COVID first hit, I know we closed our career force, which we had open computer lab for people to come in and apply. And that was such a big challenge for people to come in. They didn't have anywhere to go. And then, on our end, we switched over to going to the public library so that we could meet job seekers there. But I think that's still a issue even today. Like yesterday, I was in the office, helped three gentlemen applying for jobs because they don't have access to computers at home. And the only way they can get a computer is when they come to the career force.
Thanks. Suhur, I'm going to come back to you. So we're talking a little bit about this, about relationships, what Tammy mentioned, and I'm curious. It seems like some of the data is suggesting that lots of people are spending lots of time online applying for jobs, maybe not having great success. And I'm wondering to what extent the old time notion of networking would be helpful. How do you, first, is there a lot of networking that happens among your clients? And if not, how do you rebuild that sense of, the old adage, not what you know, it's who you know?
That has been challenging with COVID. I think with people not wanting to either, places aren't open to come in and network, or they're not comfortable going out to places where they aren't able to network. I know in our agency, Career Solutions, we have a job club meeting that we were trying to get our job seekers into into networking. They come in together once a week, whether it's just to network, help each other, find what's available. Us doing some job seeking, like a little bit of job seeking with them, or I guess helping them, like whether it's LinkedIn or find out how to use LinkedIn or things like that. So I think if it's not facilitated like that, I think it'll be very hard to get people to come in to do networking.
Sure. Tammy or Ginny, any additional thoughts on that?
I can add, we also have, we call them Discovery Day events, where it's a hands-on activity for an industry sector, such as CDL, construction, manufacturing, healthcare, so that they can have a hands-on activity. And employers come in, and it's kind of more like a roundtable conversation between employers and job seekers. They get to experience some of what the work is like, for example, welding. The employers can see their welds from being in the lab. And if they see that there's some talent there, they can continue to pursue a conversation with them. It's not a job fair. It's less formal than an interview. It's kind of like a hybrid, and the comfort level for engagement there has been great. So it's kind of a new twist on a job fair that I think is gaining some traction in our area.
Jenny, anything else to add on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with the other two that, these in-person kind of networking opportunities, because we've lost a lot of those opportunities, I think that connection has really suffered, and I think that it's harder to make some of those connections. So, the more that we can see some of that open up, I think the better. And employers are really interested in seeing people face to face too. And I think that's part of the challenge is how do we navigate this new world and use it to our benefit, but also keep, components of the way things used to be in terms of meeting in person and at least the strong points of those components, and really bring career seekers to our employer partners.
Thanks, Ginny. Let me turn to more of a policy-oriented question here. Tammy, I'm gonna go with you first. I'm curious, what would you tell, knowing what you know, and with some of these survey results as well, I'm curious, what advice, or, where do policymakers start making their first steps, or maybe not even first steps? How would you advise a policymaker on where to go in this particular space that is so broad, has so many things, to consider? How do you start getting your hands around this if you're a policymaker?
I think it starts by learning what options are out there, reaching out and connecting with resources such as Ginny and myself and the other directors from across the state. Our agencies are there to help. We kind of have a pulse of the different things that are going on, and there's places where we can advise. There's also places where we can jump on and support. Examples of how can we get a youth builder who went through the youth build program onto a construction site in a limited capacity before they turn 18. That's something that we can't do alone. The businesses need to rally around, but jointly together, I think we can have conversations with policymakers that help open up opportunities so that we can take that next generation of the workforce and get them involved. So I just use that as one example, but I think there's power in joining together, collaborating to get the message across, because we can speak from the different perspectives. We bring the job seeker's perspective when the employers bring the employer's experience.
Ginny or Suhur?
I think, in terms of policy, I think one of the things that our policymakers can actually can have some influence over is definitely our childcare challenges. You know, I think with licensing and training and all of the nuances that go into that, including starting out your own business and entrepreneurship. I mean, I think there needs to be a better network for individuals that are potentially entering that career field, and then also those that are, you know, in the career field to talk about some of the policy that's preventing us from being able to expand some of those opportunities. So I think from a policy standpoint, that's one thing. And then also just agree with Tammy, you know, at the local level, we have a very, you know, we have a pulse of what's happening with our employers, with our career seekers. And so the more that we can talk with policymakers and, you know, be heard at the local level about what's happening and some of the things, some of the solutions that are already in place that we could use some support for and some enhancement of, you know, versus recreating or developing something new, I think that would be really helpful as well.
So who are any thoughts on this policymaker question?
I agree with Tammy and Jeannie. So for me, I think with housing being such an issue, I think a lot of it affects a lot of our job seekers and what kind of jobs they can take. You know, somebody can't take a job where even if they like the position, hours is flexible, but if the pay is not there to pay the rent, they can't do that. So I think just how having something in place with housing and making that a little bit more affordable.
Okay, thanks. Ginny, I'm going to come back to you with this, and this is maybe more of a turning the lens on the workforce development system. So as an outsider, I've been kind of in the workforce development systems in a bunch of different states now for the last year, and I have a lot to learn about it. But the one thing that has kind of struck me in Minnesota is that it seems to the outsider as very complex. Lots of different providers, lots of different programs, lots and lots of things. And I'm wondering if you might all just give me some thoughts on where the workforce development system in the state could make some improvements in the way it in any number of ways. I guess I don't want to put anyone, I don't want to direct anyone anywhere. So what would you say in terms of the workforce development system here, where improvements could be made for everyone's benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think the number one thing is more collaboration and coordination at the local level with the partners. There are multiple partners in the system, and it is very complex and confusing, but I really truly believe that we try hard to make it as seamless and not confusing for the career seeker and employer experience. So, you know, when they come into our door, when they're coming to access services, we really want the no wrong door feel. You know, we really want an open door policy, and we really want us internally to try to figure out, you know, how to serve them best and which funding stream and which agency and all of that. So we do try hard to, you know, at the local level to make that career seeker and employer experience very seamless. But, you know, in terms of the complicated system that we do have, I think just coordination and connection at the local level with all the entities involved. And then also through that local lens, you know, our workforce development boards across the state, there's one in every workforce development area, and really relying on them to provide information about what's happening at the local level and what are some solutions that could really benefit the local area.
So who are any thoughts on that? On the workforce development system, you're kind of, you know, at the ground level working on clients. What do they tell you regarding, you know, how easy it is to seek and get help?
Yep. I think it makes it a little bit challenging with, you know, I know you said the survey didn't mention transportation, but that's also a barrier for a lot of people coming into the offices, especially if they need to come in for multiple services or multiple occasions. I think going into the communities is maybe somewhere where we need to consider. I know in our agency, we before COVID, we would go out into the community centers in neighborhoods that are in high need of job seekers, and being able to go out into those communities. And I think transportation is the biggest challenge of having them come into our locations.
Tammy, any final thoughts on that particular issue?
I think they both said it very well.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Hoover, I'm going to come back to you on this question. You know, I think one of the issues of this particular problem is that I think we need to see workers more individually. And I'm wondering if you and the other panelists might have any anecdotes, anonymously, of course, because we don't want to name anybody, but I'm wondering if you've had a client recently that really does kind of encapsulate a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. And if you might maybe describe, just kind of give us their story a little bit to make it a little bit more personal for people listening today.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned yesterday, I was in the office, I helped 3 gentlemen, all of them came in together because I worked with one and he told his friends, oh, I heard there's a job, because there's a company I met with, they were looking to hire more immigrants. And I said, this company is in town, they're hiring, they're paid well. Do you want to come and apply? He came in with 2 other friends, they're like, oh, we're also looking for jobs. Can you help us apply for this? We heard, this company's here. There was other locations I mentioned. Again, I think the one of them being in a town nearby, which was a little too far for them. So I think that transportation of having to go a little further was difficult for them. But I think for them, there was a language barrier, there was lack of transportation, but then there was also internet issues. So they didn't have computers, they don't know how to navigate computers. And we know within, specifically for our Somali community that we work with in central Minnesota, it's a word of mouth. So for us, they are able to tell each other what's available out there, and then come in and, typically they'll say, okay, let's apply to the same area together. So that way they are able to eliminate some of the barriers themselves. So if 1 or 2 people have issues with transportation, maybe the third one has a transportation, they can carpool together. So some of those, that was a really good example that just happened yesterday, but they were able to apply for the same position. We'll see if they have 3 open positions, but yeah.
Right. Tammy or Ginny, any anecdotes that you'd like to share about clients that have come in the doors recently?
Ginny, go ahead.
Okay, I can go. Yeah, I'll just combine, I'll kind of combine a few, so the single mother that had to leave her place of employment because her daycare closed, 6 times in 6 months because of COVID, and had to make that decision. And so now has a gap in that work history and is not being chosen for interviews due to, potentially due to that gap in work history, and is also switching careers, decided that she wanted to leave healthcare and wants to go into a different sector, probably has all the skill sets necessary for the jobs that she's applying for, maybe even overqualified for some of those positions, but because she doesn't have experience in that sector, isn't being chosen for interviews and things like that. So, those are some of the challenges that we're seeing, with job seekers, with moving, trying to change careers, trying to get back into the workforce, trying to continue to navigate, childcare and transportation challenges, while all, trying to find employment, which, hasn't been an easy road for them. So that's just another anecdote.
And I guess I can add, we also work with youth starting at age 14 and up, and we're trying to help educate them on how to be a good employee, teach them those soft skills. And one of our federal programs allows work experiences where, in essence, we're the employer and we can send them out into a work experience. It gives the employers, kind of as the supervisor, coaching them, and it takes one of our staff that's also invested in that work experience becoming successful. So if feedback is needed, it can come in 2 forms, from the supervisor and or from our career counselors. So, we can help groom them and make them successful. And we have a few work experiences actually working in Career Force right now in St. Cloud. And we are that mentor. As a team, we're mentoring those 2 youth to help them be successful before we turn them over to an employer. So we're helping them learn and groom them to be good employees.
Thanks, Tammy. Let me come back to you. And I think this may be at least one of our last questions, maybe 2. I'm curious if there's anything that we've missed, like if each of you have maybe a pet, maybe not a pet peeve, but really something that you want to get on the stump for that has been discussed today. What haven't we talked about that at least needs to get raised here for the people in the audience today?
One thing for marketing positions, the role of an HR person, I think, has changed drastically. You used to be able to post the jobs out on your website, out on the, different, like Minnesota Works, Indeed, wherever, and you'd start to receive applications. But if you want to expand into other demographics, that takes work. And it's almost to the point where your HR team needs to have their own strategic plan, and that there's someone with marketing skills on that team. How to utilize social media. You think of radio, which radio doesn't always seem to net, I think, what employers are expecting. However, if you were to use Somali radio, you would see a greater impact because they are more of an auditory community. So just kind of learning some of those lessons does not come easily without a lot of work. So just, framing that, I think, roles for people in that whole recruitment process, and the recruitment process itself needs some attention. One example is we bring job seekers into our HR networking group. A candidate could have been screened out by their resume. However, when the HR person met them, looked at them eye to eye, then heard their three-minute commercial about themselves and their skills, they then set up an interview. So, making sure there's still that opportunity for human connection.
Wonderful. Ginny, any thoughts on that? Do you have a stump speech for us?
Well, I like to talk about this term that I've just kind of created called the opportunity mismatch, and I liked your slide where you talked about that there's a multitude of reasons that people aren't getting connected, and it's not all from the career seeker side and it's not all from the employer side, but there is this opportunity mismatch, and where we can start talking about non-negotiables versus negotiables for employment opportunities. I think that's a really great opportunity to start talking about, some of the things that used to be on our, even as an employer myself, as on our non-negotiable list, have now been moved to negotiable, and I think that being able to talk about all the things that go into that mismatch versus, if you look just on paper at the number of jobs available, it's really easy to just deduce that, there's enough jobs for everybody and everybody should have a job right now. But if you dig into the data, like you've shown us, there is a number of different reasons for that mismatch, and to start really tackling that by looking at those negotiable lists and non-negotiable lists, I think is really helpful.
Thanks, Jenny. You made a couple of phrases there that I might have to steal. I like that. Sahur, I'm going to give you the last comment. We're getting very close to the end of our session. Sahur, any last thoughts?
I mentioned technology a couple of times, but I think for that, with employers, I think having an option of bringing back maybe a paper format couple for employers, specifically certain employers that do target communities that have language barriers that may not, or that have no access to internet or computer, having having applications that employers can go ahead and pick up and fill out, or do it on the spot and just turn it in. I know with technology, it makes it so much easier not have to waste paper, but I think it's limiting a lot of potential job seekers that don't have access to our career force, that they can just go in and use a computer there, or if they do have a computer, they may not know how to use a computer. So maybe considering paper applications for industries that you're targeting specific communities that may need it.
Wonderful. Let me take this opportunity to say thank you to the three of you. This has been a wonderful discussion, way better than the first part of this webinar. So I appreciate all of your insights and energy for this particular webinar. That brings us to a close today. Thank you again to Tammy and Ginny and Sahur. Thank you to everybody that attended today. I do want to note we have some additional webinars coming up. Those have been posted in the chat box. Again, there is a survey that we would love for you to take to give us some feedback when you hit leave. We'd appreciate that feedback. Otherwise, thanks for attending today and have a wonderful day. Thanks much.